"Oh, honey, you must be lost. Economy is that way." With that one sentence, a senior flight attendant didn't just insult a family. She sealed her own fate. She sneered at them, served them last, and treated them like dirt, all while flying at 35,000 feet. What she didn't know was that the quiet, dignified man in seat 2A wasn't just another passenger. He was David Monroe. And the Monroe family didn't just buy first-class tickets. They owned the entire airline. This isn't just a story about racism. It's a story about what happens when prejudice meets power and karma takes the controls. "Oh, honey, you must be lost. Economy is that way." The voice, dripping with a syrupy false sweetness, cut through the quiet hum of the Boeing 787's first-class cabin. It was aimed directly at 16-year-old Zoe Monroe, who had paused at the entrance to the galley, marveling at the sheer space. Zoe froze her designer backpack, feeling suddenly heavy on her shoulders. She turned to see a flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s with tightly pinned blonde hair and a name tag that read Brenda, smiling a smile that didn't reach her cold blue eyes. The woman gestured vaguely with a manicured hand towards the back of the plane. Before Zoe could form a response, a calm, deep voice came from behind her. "She's exactly where she's supposed to be. As are we all." David Monroe stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a tailored casual blazer and dark trousers. He carried an aura of quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. Beside him, his wife, Vivian, exuded an effortless elegance, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the flight attendant. Their 10-year-old son, Leo, peered from behind his father, his eyes wide with curiosity. Brenda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She scanned their boarding passes, which David held out silently. Her eyes flickered over the names, Monroe, and the seat numbers, 2A, 2B, 2D, and 2G, the most coveted seats in the cabin. "Ah," she said, her tone shifting from condescending to clinical. "I see. Row 2, right this way." She led them into the spacious, pod-like seats, her movements stiff and dismissive. The Monroe family was flying from New York's JFK to London Heathrow on AeroVista Airlines, a trip that was part business, part long-overdue family vacation. David and Vivian had built their empire from the ground up, starting with a small tech consulting firm 2 decades ago, and growing it into the Monroe Equity Group, a colossal private holding company with a diverse portfolio that included tech real estate, and most recently, a controlling interest in Pantheon Transportation, the parent company of AeroVista Airlines. This acquisition was so new, so high-level, that not even most of the airline's C-suite executives were aware of the full extent of the new ownership structure. To the frontline staff, they were just names on a memo they'd likely ignored. As they settled in, the difference in treatment was immediate and palpable. Brenda offered pre-departure drinks. The white businessman in seat 1A, a Mr. Henderson, was offered champagne in a crystal flute. When she got to the Monroes, she asked curtly, "Orange juice or water?" without presenting the full menu. "I'll have a sparkling water with lime, please." Vivian said, her voice smooth as silk, betraying no hint of annoyance. "And I'll have the same," David added. Brenda returned moments later with their drinks in standard plastic cups, the kind usually reserved for premium economy. David glanced over at Mr. Henderson's crystal flute, then at his own plastic cup, and a small knowing look passed between him and his wife. He didn't say a word. He simply took a sip, leaned back in his multi-$1,000 seat, and observed. Zoe, however, was simmering. "Dad, did you see that she gave him a real glass?" And her tone, she thought we were in the wrong section. "I saw sweetheart," David said quietly, his eyes never leaving Brenda as she moved through the cabin, laughing and chatting warmly with other passengers. Some people build their whole world on a foundation of assumptions. Let's not trouble ourselves with their shaky architecture. Vivian reached across the aisle and squeezed her daughter's hand. Your father is right. Don't let one person's ignorance dim your light. We are here to enjoy our trip. We are not here to educate the willfully blind. Not yet, anyway. The flight pushed back from the gate. As Brenda performed the safety demonstration, her eyes seemed to slide right over the Monroe family as if they were invisible. When she collected the pre-departure glasses, she snatched the plastic cups from the Monroe's consoles without a word, while again sharing a pleasantry with Mr. Henderson. The initial insult had been sharp, but this sustained, deliberate campaign of microaggressions was something different. It was a calculated effort to make them feel unwelcome, to put them in their place. Brenda was marking her territory, reinforcing a worldview where a black family, no matter how well-dressed or composed, simply did not belong in her first-class cabin. David Monroe watched her every move. He noted the slight curl of her lip when she walked past his seat, the way she avoided eye contact, the exaggerated warmth she showed to every white passenger. He was a man who had built an empire by understanding systems, by identifying weaknesses and pressure points. And in Brenda, he saw a flaw, not just in a person, but in the system he now owned. This flight, he realized, had just turned from a vacation into an audit, a real-world high-stakes audit at 35,000 feet. And Brenda had no idea she was the primary subject. The Boeing 777 leveled off at its cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign pinged off, and the cabin crew began their dinner service. The atmosphere in first class was supposed to be one of serene luxury, a haven of comfort above the clouds. But for the Monroe family, a subtle chilling tension remained, emanating from the smiling, hostile presence of Brenda. Chloe, a younger flight attendant with kind eyes and a nervous energy, approached them first. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe, can I get you started with an aperitif? We have an excellent selection of wines, or perhaps a cocktail. She spoke with genuine warmth, handing them leather-bound menus. Thank you, Chloe, Vivian said, rewarding the young woman with a warm smile. That's very kind. They placed their orders, and for a moment the atmosphere felt normal, but then Brenda returned, pushing the meal cart. She seemed to deliberately position it so that it partially blocked David's access to the aisle. She served the passengers in front of them first, then conspicuously skipped over the Monroes to serve the couple in row 3. Excuse me, Zoe said, her voice louder than she intended. I think you missed us. Brenda turned slowly, her face a mask of feigned surprise. Oh, did I? So sorry. It's just so busy tonight. She looked down at her manifest. Monroe, right. Let's see what we have left for you. Left for us? David asked, his voice still perfectly calm, but with an edge that could cut glass. We pre-ordered our meals 2 weeks ago, as requested by the airline. This was a standard perk for first-class passengers, guaranteeing their choice of meal. Brenda's face tightened. The pre-order system was electronic and foolproof. Claiming they didn't have the meals was a direct and malicious lie. Our system sometimes has glitches, she said, waving a dismissive hand. It seems we only have the chicken or the vegetarian pasta remaining. Vivian, who had pre-ordered the pan-seared Chilean sea bass, simply stared at Brenda. That's peculiar, she said. The system seemed to be working perfectly when it sent me a confirmation email. Perhaps you could double-check. Brenda's composure finally cracked. A flash of pure venom crossed her face before she replaced it with her plastic smile. I assure you, ma'am, if the sea bass was here, I would give it to you. It's the chicken or the pasta. At that moment, little Leo, trying to reach for his activity book, knocked his plastic cup of apple juice. It tipped over, spilling onto the plush carpet beside his seat. It was a small spill, easily cleaned. Brenda reacted as if he had detonated a small bomb. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" She snapped, her voice sharp and loud enough to turn heads. She threw a contemptuous look at Vivian. "Can you please try to control your children? This is a first-class cabin, not a playground." The entire cabin fell silent. Mr. Dea, Henderson in seat 1A, lowered his newspaper, a frown creasing his brow. Chloe, who was nearby, rushed over with a handful of napkins, looking mortified. Vivian Monroe's demeanor shifted. The graceful composure was still there, but now it was layered with steel. She turned her full attention to Brenda. "First," she said, her voice low and dangerously precise, "you will not speak to my son or to me in that tone ever again. It was an accident. Second, you will stop this pathetic little performance of yours." Brenda, empowered by what she perceived as her authority in the cabin, doubled down. "My performance, I'm trying to maintain a standard of service here. Perhaps you're not used to it." She then muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Probably got the tickets using 1,000,000 credit card points and don't know how to act." That was it. The line had been crossed. It was no longer about bad service. It was a direct, ugly assault on their character and legitimacy. Chloe, trying to defuse the situation, whispered, "Brenda, please." "Stay out of this, Chloe," Brenda hissed back. "I'm the senior purser here. I'll handle it." David Monroe, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, slowly folded his hands in his lap. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved a muscle. But the temperature around him seemed to drop by 20 degrees. He looked directly at Brenda, and for the first time she felt a genuine prickle of fear. It wasn't anger she saw in his eyes. It was something far more terrifying assessment. He was looking at her like a scientist studying a specimen right before dissection. "Brenda," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "Bring my wife the sea bass that you know you have. Bring my son another apple juice in a proper glass, and then leave this section of the cabin. Your colleague Chloe will handle our service for the remainder of the flight." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never had an order questioned. Brenda was stunned into silence. Her entire worldview, her sense of power and place, was being challenged by this man. Who did he think he was? Her mind raced, trying to place him. A celebrity? A politician? No, she would have recognized him. He was just an arrogant passenger who needed to be put in his place. Her pride, her most fatal flaw, refused to let her back down. "I don't take orders from passengers," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "The captain is the only one who gives me orders on this aircraft, and I will serve this cabin as I see fit." David Monroe simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "An interesting policy," he said softly. "We'll have to circle back to that." He then turned his gaze away from her, dismissing her as completely as one might dismiss a fly. He looked at his wife and gave her a reassuring nod. The message was clear: I have this under control. Brenda stood there for a moment, fuming and humiliated, the focus of the cabin's silent attention. She had won the battle in her mind, asserting her authority. But the look in David Monroe's eyes told a different story. She hadn't won anything. She had just armed him. Brenda retreated to the galley, her hands shaking with adrenaline. Chloe was already there, her face pale. "Brenda, what are you doing?" Chloe whispered, her voice urgent. "You can't treat people like that. I don't care who they are." "I know exactly who they are," Brenda spat, grabbing a bottle of water and twisting the cap with unnecessary force. "They're nouveau riche, who think a fancy ticket gives them the right to run the plane. I've been doing this job for 18 years. I know the type. They need to be reminded that there are still rules." They haven't broken any rules, Chloe insisted. They've been nothing but polite, and you've been horrible to them since the moment they stepped on board. Mind your own business. Brenda snapped her authority as senior purser, her only remaining shield. Go do your job. Chloe looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust before turning to leave the galley. Back in her seat, Vivian was comforting Leo, who was upset by the confrontation. Zoe was still furious, texting furiously on her phone, likely venting to a friend. David, however, was a picture of perfect calm. He had pulled a tablet from his briefcase and was scrolling through a document, but his focus wasn't on the screen. He was listening, waiting. After about 20 minutes, he pressed the call button. It chimed softly. A moment later, Brenda appeared, her professional smile plastered back on her face, though it looked brittle enough to shatter. Yes, how can I help you? David looked up from his tablet. Brenda, he said, his tone casual, conversational. You mentioned you've been with the airline for 18 years. That's a long time. You must have started back when it was still branded as Atlantic Blue Airways, before the Pantheon acquisition. Brenda blinked, taken aback by the question. It was oddly specific. Yes, that's right, she said cautiously. I was here for the rebranding to AeroVista. Interesting, David said, tapping his chin. That was a difficult transition. I remember reading about the challenges with integrating the seniority lists for the cabin crews. A lot of tension. He looked directly at her. You must have navigated that quite well to become a senior purser. A knot of unease began to form in Brenda's stomach. How did this man know about the internal union disputes from over a decade ago? It wasn't common public knowledge. He spoke with the familiarity of an insider. She dismissed it as a fluke. Maybe he was an aviation enthusiast, a plane geek. It was a challenging time. She conceded, trying to maintain her professional distance. I'm sure, David continued, his gaze unwavering. And what do you think of the new leadership at the Pantheon level, the Monroe Equity Group? Bit of a shake-up, I hear. He said his name casually, as if discussing a third party. Brenda's heart skipped a beat. Monroe. The name on the boarding pass. The name of the new holding group. It couldn't be. It was just a coincidence, a common name. Her mind scrambled for a plausible explanation. I don't really follow the corporate side of things. She stammered the lie, thin and weak. Every senior employee had been briefed on the acquisition. The name Monroe Equity Group had been in memos and internal communications for months. I just focus on providing the best in-flight experience for our passengers. Of course, David said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. And you do that by upholding the AeroVista standard of care. Correct, that's what the internal training module calls it, isn't it? Module 4B, if I recall. The color drained from Brenda's face. Module 4B, the mandatory annual customer service refresher. No passenger on Earth would know that designation. Not a frequent flyer, not an aviation geek, not even a journalist. Only someone with access to the company's internal training and operations manuals could know that. The foundation of assumptions that David had spoken of earlier began to crumble beneath her feet. The sarcastic insult at the door, the plastic cups, the lie about the sea base, the vicious outburst at a 10-year-old boy, all of it flashed through her mind, recontextualized under a terrifying new light. She stared at the man in seat 2A. He wasn't just a wealthy passenger. The way he watched her, the precision of his questions, the unnerving calm. It all started to make a horrible, sickening sense. Is there anything else you need, sir? She asked, her voice now a strained, barely audible whisper. The word sir came out instinctively, a product of pure, unadulterated fear. "No, Brenda," David Monroe said softly, his eyes boring into hers. "Not from you. You may go now." Brenda turned and walked back to the galley on legs that felt like jelly. She leaned against a counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. Coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. But deep down, in a place that pride had long since silenced, she knew it wasn't. She had spent the last 2 hours tormenting a family, blissfully unaware that she wasn't just insulting a passenger. She may have been insulting her ultimate boss. The gravity of her miscalculation began to sink in, and it felt like the floor of the aircraft had just dropped out from under her. She was flying at 35,000 feet, but she had never felt closer to a catastrophic fall. Brenda spent the next hour hiding in the galley, a whirlwind of panic and denial raging within her. She replayed David Monroe's words over and over. Atlantic Blue Airways, Module 4B, Monroe Equity Group. It was too specific, too precise. The name on the boarding pass was not a coincidence. It was a time bomb she had carelessly armed and set on her own lap. She had to fix it. She had to backtrack, apologize, and grovel. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Taking a deep breath, she composed herself as best she could. She found the pre-ordered sea bass, plated it beautifully on the finest china the aircraft carried, and placed it on a tray with a crystal glass of the most expensive Chardonnay. With a trembling hand, she carried it out to the cabin. She approached Vivian Monroe with a deeply deferential air. "Mrs. Monroe," she began, her voice quivering slightly. "My sincerest apologies. It seems there was a misunderstanding with the manifest. I have your C base." Vivian looked from the plate to Brenda's terrified face. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Thank you, Brenda. You can place it here." There was no warmth in her voice, only a cool, detached acceptance. There was no forgiveness. Brenda then turned to David. "Mr. Monroe, sir, I am so sorry for my earlier unprofessionalism. There is no excuse." David didn't even look up from his tablet. He simply said, "Apology noted. As I said, Chloe will be handling our service." The dismissal was more brutal than any tirade could have been. It communicated that she was now irrelevant, a problem already slated for resolution. Desperate, Brenda committed her final career-ending mistake. She believed she could still salvage the situation by appealing to a higher, yet more immediate authority. She decided to go to the captain, frame the family as difficult and demanding, and paint herself as the victim of their unreasonable behavior. It was a long shot, but it was all she had left. But David Monroe was always 3 steps ahead. He had anticipated her next move. Just as she was about to retreat to the galley to formulate her plan, he looked up from his tablet, his eyes locking onto hers with chilling intensity. He pressed his call button. The soft chime echoed in the silent cabin. Brenda, already on her feet nearby, approached him like a condemned prisoner. "Yes, sir." "Brenda," David said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the quiet cabin. "I'd like to have a word with the captain, please, when he has a moment and it's safe to do so." This was it. Her chance. She could frame the narrative. "Of course, sir," she said, a flicker of hope returning. "May I tell him what it's regarding? He's very busy managing the flight." The implication was clear. The captain shouldn't be bothered with trivial passenger complaints. David Monroe leaned forward slightly. He lowered his voice, not out of secrecy, but for dramatic effect, forcing her to lean in, forcing her to be complicit in her own undoing. "Tell Captain Miller," David said slowly and distinctly, "that David Monroe of Monroe Equity Group would like a word regarding a serious breach of the AeroVista standard of care by a member of his crew." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. "Tell him it's a code red personnel issue. He'll know what that means." Every word was a hammer blow. The full name, the full title, the name of the holding company, the specific internal corporate jargon, Code Red, a term reserved for critical incidents that required immediate executive attention. Brenda's world dissolved. The blood rushed from her head, leaving a roaring sound in her ears. The carefully constructed artifice of her life, her seniority, her authority, her perceived superiority, all of it evaporated in that single devastating sentence. This wasn't a plain geek. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the man who signed the checks 5 or 6 levels removed the invisible hand that guided the entire multi-billion-dollar corporation. And she had spent the last 3 hours treating his family like garbage. She could only nod her throat, too tight to form words. She turned, walking towards the cockpit door like she was walking the plank. Every eye in the first-class cabin was on her. Mr. Henderson watched with a grimly satisfied expression. Chloe, standing by the galley, looked on with profound sympathy, not for Brenda, but for the predictable and catastrophic conclusion of her colleague's own making. Brenda pressed the intercom button for the cockpit. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. I need to speak with you. It's urgent." The man she had intended to use as her shield was about to become her executioner. The cockpit door buzzed open. Brenda stepped inside the door, clicking shut behind her, sealing her in with her fate. Captain Frank Miller, a veteran pilot with graying temples and a no-nonsense demeanor, turned in his seat. The first officer, a younger man named Kevin, glanced back curiously. "What is it?" Brenda, Captain Miller asked, his tone betraying a hint of annoyance at the unscheduled interruption. "Everything all right back there?" "Captain," she began, her voice trembling. "There's a passenger in 2A. He's demanding to speak with you." Miller sighed. "Demanding? Tell him I'll speak to him on the ground, unless it's a genuine security threat. You know the protocol." "No, sir, you don't understand." Brenda choked out tears, welling in her eyes. He said to tell you that David Monroe of Monroe Equity Group wants to speak with you. He said it's a Code Red personnel issue." The change in Captain Miller's demeanor was instantaneous and absolute. His back straightened. He swiveled his chair fully, his eyes widening in alarm. He knew that name. Every captain, every manager, every executive at AeroVista and its parent company, Pantheon Transportation, knew that name. David Monroe was not just an investor. He was, for all intents and purposes, the new king. A Code Red call from him mid-flight was unprecedented. It was the corporate equivalent of a 5-alarm fire. "Who?" Miller asked, his voice now sharp and urgent, wanting to be sure he'd heard correctly. "David Monroe," Brenda repeated miserably. "He's in 2A, with his family." The captain's eyes narrowed, connecting the dots with horrifying speed. The name, the family, the personnel issue. He looked at Brenda's pale, terrified face. "Brenda, what did you do?" Brenda broke down completely, a torrent of panicked sobs and incoherent excuses pouring out of her. "I didn't know. I thought they were... There was a spill." Captain Miller held up a hand, cutting her off. He had heard enough. His face was a mask of cold fury. This wasn't just a customer service complaint anymore. This was a direct insult to the man who owned the company, a man whose signature could liquidate entire divisions. Brenda hadn't just made a mistake. She had potentially jeopardized the entire airline's leadership, starting with him. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. He unbuckled his harness. "Kevin, you have the flight." "Yes, Captain," the first officer replied, his eyes wide. Captain Miller smoothed down his uniform, took a deep breath, and exited the cockpit. He walked the few steps into the first-class cabin, his expression grim. He completely ignored Brenda as she stumbled out behind him. His eyes scanned the cabin and immediately found the family in row 2. He walked directly to them, stopping in the aisle beside David Monroe's seat. He stood at attention, his posture ramrod straight. "Mr. Monroe," he said, his voice clear and formal, resonating through the now deathly silent cabin. "I am Captain Frank Miller. I understand you wish to speak with me. Sir, I want to offer my most profound and sincere apology for any unprofessional conduct you and your family have experienced on my flight. It is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be dealt with the utmost severity." David Monroe looked up from his tablet, his expression unreadable. "Captain Miller, thank you for coming out. Please don't let this distract you from your primary duty of flying this plane safely to our destination. Sir, the safety of my passengers includes their well-being and comfort," the captain insisted. "What has occurred is a gross failure of that duty. On behalf of the entire crew, I am deeply sorry." Vivian looked at the captain, her gaze softening slightly. "We appreciate that, Captain," she said. "Your personal apology is accepted." The captain nodded, his relief palpable. "Thank you, ma'am. Is there anything at all I can do to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable?" "You can ensure," David said, his eyes flicking for a moment to where Brenda stood, frozen in horror, by the galley, "that your senior purser does not interact with my family, or any other passenger for that matter, for the rest of this flight. Her colleague Chloe has been perfectly professional and is more than capable of managing the cabin." "Consider it done, sir," Captain Miller said, without hesitation. He turned to Brenda, his eyes like chips of ice. "Brenda, go to the crew rest area. You are relieved of all duties until we land. Do not leave the rest area. Do not speak to any passengers. Is that understood?" Humiliation washed over Brenda in a sickening wave. In front of the entire cabin, the colleagues she lauded her seniority over the passengers she had tried to impress, she was being publicly stripped of her duties and exiled. She could only manage a weak, pathetic nod. She turned, and without making eye contact with anyone, made the walk of shame to the small windowless crew bunk area, her career and reputation in ashes around her. The captain gave another respectful nod to the Monroes, then returned to the cockpit. The cabin slowly returned to a state of quiet, but the air had changed. The power dynamic had been inverted with stunning speed and finality. Mr. Henderson raised his champagne flute in a silent, respectful toast to David, who simply acknowledged it with a slight dip of his head. Zoe looked at her father, her earlier anger replaced by awe. "Wow, Dad," she whispered. David finally allowed a small, tired smile to touch his lips. He reached over and squeezed her hand. "It's not about power, Zoe," he said quietly. "It's about responsibility. When you have the ability to fix a problem, you have the responsibility to do so. Not just for us, but for everyone who comes after us." The lesson was far more powerful than any lecture on racism could ever be. It was a live demonstration of grace strategy and the quiet, unshakable force of consequence. As the Boeing 777 began its final descent, a blanket of tense silence settled over the first-class cabin, thick and suffocating. The usual pre-landing chatter was absent. Passengers subtly watched the galley from which Brenda had never re-emerged. Chloe moved through the cabin with quiet, somber efficiency, her face a mask of professionalism that couldn't quite hide the stress in her eyes. David Monroe calmly read a book to Leo, while Vivian stared out the window, watching the patchwork of the English countryside grow larger, her expression thoughtful and resolute. The majestic approach to one of the world's busiest airports was a silent, beautiful backdrop to the ugly human drama that was about to reach its conclusion. For Brenda, locked in the cramped, windowless crew rest compartment, the descent was a special kind of torture. The gentle bumps of turbulence felt like hammer blows of fate. The captain's smooth professional announcements about weather and landing times were a countdown to her doom. She could hear the muffled sounds of the cabin being prepared for arrival, the clicks of tray tables, the rustle of jackets, and each sound reminded her of the world she was about to be violently ejected from. The authority and pride she had cultivated over 18 years had evaporated, leaving only a raw, primal fear. Down on the tarmac inside the gleaming steel and glass of Terminal 5, Robert Patterson, CEO of AeroVista Airlines, was power-walking through the terminal, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had been in a board meeting discussing quarterly fuel hedging strategies when his personal phone had buzzed with a call from an unlisted satellite number. It was Captain Frank Miller. The captain's voice had been grim, concise, and utterly terrifying. He relayed the facts without emotion, the passenger's identity, the code red declaration, the nature of the purser's conduct. Patterson had felt the blood drain from his face. David Monroe, the architect of the new ownership, a man known for his quiet demeanor and ruthless efficiency, a man who did not make idle threats. Patterson had excused himself from the meeting, his mind racing. This wasn't a customer complaint. This was a potential corporate decapitation. His career, his bonus, the very stability of the airline's current leadership. It was all hanging by the thread of this one incident. He had scrambled his station manager and head of security barking orders into his phone as he raced to the gate, arriving just as the jet bridge was being connected, his tailored suit feeling tight and his brow slick with sweat. The moment the aircraft door opened, Patterson's practiced CEO smile was in place, though it did little to hide the panic in his eyes. He watched as the first few passengers deplaned, then he saw them. The Monroe family. They looked poised, elegant, and completely unruffled. He stepped forward as David Monroe entered the jet bridge. "Mr. Monroe," he began, his voice slightly breathless. "Robert Patterson. I am so terribly sorry. I came the moment I heard." David met his extended hand with a firm, cool grip. "Mr. Patterson, your captain handled the immediate situation with the professionalism I would expect from your flight crews. But the situation should never have occurred," Patterson insisted, turning to include Vivian in his apology. "Mrs. Monroe, on behalf of every single employee at AeroVista, I am mortified. The behavior you and your family were subjected to, the insults, the deliberate withholding of service, the frankly disgusting language used towards your son is anathema to this company. It is a cancer, and I promise you we will cut it out." Vivian's gaze was sharp and discerning. She was not interested in flowery apologies. She wanted action. "Robert," she said, her voice cutting through his frantic assurances, "here is what is going to happen. The employee in question will be terminated. That is not negotiable. Then you will conduct a full independent audit of your diversity and inclusion policies, hiring practices, and complaint resolutions for the last 5 years. I want that report on my desk and the desks of the entire Monroe Equity Board in 30 days. Next week, you and I will have a video call where you will present to me your preliminary plan for the APEX program we discussed. Am I clear?" Patterson, who had only learned the term APEX program in a frantic text from David 10 minutes prior, could only nod. "Crystal clear, Mrs. Monroe. It will be my absolute top priority." "It had better be," David added quietly, before allowing Patterson's anxious team to escort his family away through a private corridor. Back on the now empty aircraft, Captain Miller stepped out of the cockpit. He walked to the crew rest door and knocked once. When Brenda opened it, he didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her, his face etched with a disappointment more damning than any anger. "You disgrace the uniform, Brenda," he said, his voice low and heavy. "You disgrace this aircraft, and you disgraced every one of us who does this job with pride. Get your things." He turned and walked away, leaving Brenda to face the arrival of Helen, the station manager, and a stone-faced airport security officer. Helen was a formidable woman who had worked her way up from the check-in desk. She did not suffer fools. "Brenda," she said, dispensing with any pleasantries. 18 years. 18 years of service, of seniority, of respect. And you throw it all in the bin because you couldn't stand the sight of a family that didn't fit your narrow little world view. Do you have any idea the damage you've caused?" Brenda began to stammer an excuse, but Helen held up a hand. "Save it, I'm not interested." She took out her company phone. "As of this moment, you are suspended without pay. You are to surrender your company ID, your cabin keys, and your access badge. You will be escorted off the premises. Your formal hearing is a formality, but I can tell you now the recommendation is and will be immediate termination for cause. That means your severance and a significant portion of your pension are forfeit. You brought this company into disrepute with its most critical stakeholder. There is no coming back from this." The security officer stepped forward and held out his hand for her ID. Numbly, Brenda unclipped it from her uniform and handed it over. The small piece of plastic felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The walk from the aircraft was a blur of humiliation. They didn't take her through the terminal. They led her down sterile service stairwells and through long concrete corridors deep in the airport's belly. She passed mechanics in greasy overalls who averted their eyes. She passed a group of young, handsome pilots she used to joke with, who now stared at her with open contempt before turning their backs. A junior flight attendant, whom Brenda had once written up for a minor uniform infraction, saw her being escorted and allowed a small, triumphant smirk to cross her face. The news had already spread. She was a pariah. Finally, a heavy metal door was pushed open and she was thrust out into the damp, grey misery of a London afternoon. She stood on the curb of a service road, the smell of jet fuel thick in the air. A bus rumbled past, splashing grimy water onto her shoes. Her phone felt heavy and useless in her hand. Who would she call? What would she say? She had just lost her job, her career, her pension, her identity, and her future all in the space of a 7-hour flight. The hard, cold reality of karma wasn't a lightning bolt from the sky. It was the chilling, absolute silence of a world that had moved on without her, leaving her utterly and completely alone in the rain. 2 weeks after the flight, the incident had burrowed deep into the corporate bedrock of AeroVista Airlines, setting off seismic shifts that were felt from the boardroom to the baggage claim. The story itself was never leaked to the press. The Monroe Equity Group's control over its narrative was absolute. Instead of a public scandal, the event was transformed into a powerful internal catalyst, a case study whispered in hushed tones in break rooms, and cited as gospel in management meetings. The change began in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the perpetually grey London sky. Robert Patterson, CEO of AeroVista, stood before his executive team. His face was pale, and he had lost weight in the preceding fortnight. "Let me be unequivocally clear," he began, his voice tight with a gravity the board had never heard from him before. "This is not a suggestion. This is not a quarterly initiative to boost our image. This is a fundamental top-to-bottom, non-negotiable cultural reset. Monroe Equity Group does not see what happened as an isolated incident. They see it as a symptom of a disease, and they have tasked us with excising it completely." He gestured to a large screen behind him, which displayed the sleek logo for a new program, Apex, Airline Professional Excellence and Equity. Apex isn't just new sensitivity training. Patterson continued clicking through slides detailing mandatory workshops, revamped hiring protocols to identify and eliminate bias, and a new anonymous reporting system for staff and passengers, monitored directly by an independent oversight committee appointed by the holding group. It is a new standard. Any employee from a ramp agent to a senior captain who fails to meet this standard will be considered to have voided their contract. No appeals, no lengthy reviews. We will have a zero-tolerance policy for the kind of behavior that put this company's reputation and my job on the line 2 weeks ago. This is the new cost of wearing our uniform. The message was chillingly effective. Fear, when wielded correctly, is a powerful motivator for change. The age of complacency at AeroVista was over. Miles away in a bustling crew lounge at JFK, Chloe was sipping a coffee before her next flight. She had tried to put the incident out of her mind, but the memory of Brenda's face, first arrogant, then terrified, was hard to shake. She was called over the intercom to the station manager's office, a summons that usually meant a schedule change or a minor reprimand. She entered nervously. The manager, a man she barely knew, didn't ask her to sit. He simply handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the CEO's personal letterhead. "This came for you this morning from London," he said, his expression unreadable. Chloe's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter, not from a faceless HR department, but from Robert Patterson himself. It spoke of her exemplary professionalism and moral courage under difficult circumstances. It commended her for upholding the true values of the airline when a senior colleague had failed so spectacularly. And then came the lines that made her gasp. In recognition of her conduct, she was being granted an immediate promotion to cabin purser, bypassing at least 3 years of standard seniority requirements. Furthermore, she was invited to be part of the first advisory panel for the new Apex program to provide a frontline perspective. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming shock and validation. In an industry where she often felt like a small, interchangeable part, she had been seen. Her simple act of decency had been noticed and rewarded in a way she had never imagined possible. It was a life-altering moment, a direct consequence of choosing kindness over complicity. For Brenda Jenkins, the consequences were of a different nature entirely. The world of aviation, with its crisp uniforms, global destinations, and sense of detached glamour, was a universe away from her new reality. Her termination for cause had been swift and brutal. The black mark on her record was an insurmountable barrier. Every application she sent to other airlines was met with silence. She now stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of a Value Mart discount store in a drab suburban town. The air smelled of cheap popcorn and floor cleaner. Her uniform was a shapeless, ill-fitting red smock, her name tag now just Brenda. Her job was to refold the mountains of clothes that shoppers carelessly tossed aside. A woman with a screaming toddler in her cart threw a T-shirt onto her pile. "This is a mess," the woman snapped, gesturing to the table. "You people should really try to keep this place tidier." The old Brenda would have withered the woman with a look of pure contempt. The old Brenda would have muttered a sarcastic retort. But the old Brenda was gone, buried under a mountain of debt and regret. "You're right, ma'am," Brenda mumbled, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I'll get right on it." As the woman walked away, a silver glint in the sky caught Brenda's eye through the grimy storefront window. It was a Boeing 777, the same type of aircraft climbing steeply after takeoff from the nearby international airport. The AeroVista logo on its tail was unmistakable even from this distance. A wave of nausea and a profound hollow ache washed over her. She saw it all again, the calm, assessing eyes of David Monroe, the dignified fury of his wife, the silent judgment of the entire cabin. Her whole world lost in a single flight because she couldn't stand the sight of a black family in a space she felt belonged to her. The laughter she had shared with a colleague at their expense now echoed in her memory as the most expensive sound she had ever made. The karma was not a single, crashing blow. It was a daily grinding reality, a life sentence of mediocrity served in a place where no one knew or cared about the senior purser she used to be. In a quiet, sunlit corner of his temporary London office, David Monroe read an email on his tablet. It was a forward from Robert Patterson. The body of the email contained a scanned letter written on hotel stationery. "Dear Mr. Patterson," the letter began. "I was a passenger in seat 1A on Flight 112 from JFK to LHR on July 21st. I am writing to commend your company on the swift and decisive handling of an extremely unpleasant incident involving a member of your senior cabin crew. I witnessed her deplorable racially motivated mistreatment of the family in row 2. I also witnessed the immense grace and strategic calm with which Mr. Monroe handled the situation. In a world where such ugliness often goes unchallenged, it was reassuring to see it addressed so thoroughly. My faith in your airline has been restored. Sincerely, George Henderson." David permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. It wasn't about the praise. It was the external data point, the confirmation that what they had done was not just right, but seen to be right. He deleted the email. The matter was closed. That evening, the family gathered for their last dinner in London. The mood was reflective. "I have to admit," Zoe said, pushing a piece of risotto around her plate. "My first instinct was to record her, to put it on TikTok and let the whole world see. I wanted to see her dragged online." She looked at her father. "But you played chess while I was thinking checkers. Going viral lasts a weekend. Changing a company's policy, that lasts for years." Vivian reached across the table and placed her hand on her daughter's. "I know that anger, sweetheart. I've felt it more times than I can count, especially early in our careers when we had the passion, but not the power. There were doors closed to us, assumptions made. To be able to sit on that plane and know that this time, we could do more than just endure it. That it could be a lesson, not just a scar. That is a privilege we worked our entire lives to earn." Leo, who had been listening intently, asked, "So we won." "It isn't about winning or losing, Leo," David explained, leaning forward. "Think of it this way. That flight attendant's prejudice was a vulnerability in the system. It's a weakness like a faulty part in an engine. A company that allows prejudice to fester is a company at risk. It alienates customers. It overlooks talented employees. It makes poor decisions because it's blinded by bias. My job as the owner of this system is to find and fix the weaknesses. What happened to us was ugly, but it was also useful. It showed me a big flashing red light on the dashboard." He looked around the table at his family, the reason he had built everything. "We didn't just punish one person. We used the moment to reinforce the entire structure. That woman's hatred, her small, ugly choice, will now be the reason every single one of AeroVista's 20,000 employees gets better training. Her actions will lead to a more respectful environment for millions of passengers a year of every race and background. In a strange way, she will be responsible for more good than she could ever have imagined. We didn't just get karma, we harnessed it." He raised his glass. "We turned poison into medicine, and that my family is a victory that lasts. In the end, Brenda Jenkins wasn't fired just for being a racist. She was fired for being a liability. She failed to see the world clearly, and her ignorance cost her everything. The Monroe family could have just accepted an apology, but they chose to demand accountability. They used their position not for revenge, but for reform, turning an ugly incident into a catalyst for company-wide change. This story is a powerful reminder that prejudice isn't just morally wrong. In a world of shifting power, it's also a catastrophic business strategy. True power isn't about looking down on others. It's about having the strength and wisdom to lift everyone up. What Brenda meant for evil, the Monroes used for the good of thousands. What did you think of this story of instant karma? Have you ever witnessed something like this in your own life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of justice and consequence. Thank you for watching.